Hello, story seekers. I'm Nico.
I'm Ben, and you're listening to The Tiny Bookcase.
Our guest for this episode is a novelist quoted as being as tart, dark, and juicy as a summer pudding.
She is a World Fantasy Award finalist and BSFA longlister, and in their Gyrford series, Fairy Smiths protect the world with cold iron, good counsel, and unvarnished opinions. We would like to warmly welcome Kit Whitfield.
Hello, Kit.
Hi, lovely to be here with you.
Fantastic.
Oh, it's lovely to have you. So, I'm led to believe you are involved with the ginger nuts of horror.
I am, yes, I write. Well, they're technically called reviews, but they run away with me for such a length that I think I can only get away with calling them criticism at this point. But yeah, I write a column called What's on Shudder, which is basically so I have the excuse to have a definite selection that's easily accessible. Done ones on stop motion and Mad God animation. I've done a folk horror series, done some Christmas movies last month. I have one coming up that will get me kicked out of polite society because I'm talking about Human Centipede.
Hey, classic.
Which is
I've somehow not seen that. I don't know. I've seen everything else that's depraved. I've somehow not seen that movie. Would you recommend it?
Yeah. I may be spoiling my opinions here, but the thing about it is, it's like a carnival barker act. All the creativity went into the concept and the pitch, and then the movie was made afterwards because having said they were going to, he'd made the joke, so he had to make the movie. So he made the movie, but if you've heard the concept, that's really where the energy went.
Yeah. They quite infamously, the whole thing stemmed from him saying that paedophiles should have their faces stitched to fat truckers' assholes, I believe was the quote.
Oh, so it literally was a joke, was it, that started the whole thing?
According to interviews, yes, it literally was a joke. And you'd think that you could do a more like EC Comics grotesque dark humor thing, but actually it's a bit of a dull movie. I mean, if I'm going to recommend my reviews, I would recommend more. I talk a lot about animation, talking about the movie Stop Motion and Mad God. I did a two-parter on Lord of Misrule versus The Devil's Bath, which are two recent folk horror films, in which I say one is just an example of imitation folk horror that, by missing a lot of points about what's good about it, kind of reminds us what is good about it. That's Lord of Misrule. And then there is The Devil's Bath. It's very fresh, but it's also very classic. It's really emotionally impactful. It's beautiful. Every shot is not just gorgeous to look at, but tells you a story and gives you a sense of place and theme. And while a lot of folk horror is very much in the shadow of the Wicker Man, inevitably, this was kind of a take on that concept that I did not see coming. And at this point in cinema history, that's impressive. So, yeah, I would massively recommend the film The Devil's Bath. And
fantastic. I think we got a sense of your inclination towards folk horror as well there, which is really cool. I
love folk horror.
We might be talking about that a bit more in the interview section, I think.
If you let me.
Absolutely, yeah, of course.
Well, there is, I'm afraid, Ben, a speed bump before we get to any kind of interview questions.
Story time, right?
In fact, they are story-shaped. And, as ever, you have pulled the unlucky card and are going first this episode. Our prompt for this episode is Harbour. So, Ben, release the fleet.
Harbour. The harsh barks of the seals fighting over their meal meant another body had washed up on the reef. That reef sheltered Mesto Harbour like a card-sharp shields his hand. A trick of the nearby waters meant that drowned men and poor sailors were likely to find their last resting place as part of the ossuary beds the reef seals slept on. In Roberto's lifetime, it used to happen 3, or in a bad year laden with surprise storms, up to a record 7 times a year. In the last week, the seals had barked incessantly. The coast elsewhere was sheer cliff, against which the ocean crashed in ship-breaking waves night and day. Everyone knew that only sailors, fishermen, and divers from the island could navigate through the reef into the harbour, and then only at certain moments set by the tide and the draft depths of their hulls. The islanders liked to say that reef knowledge was in the blood, but Roberto had been paid handsomely in foreign coins to make it otherwise. He had no stomach for the sea anymore anyway, so Roberto filled the place in his heart it had occupied with drink, spoke but little, and ate more than a lot. He had not left the inn for several weeks, having sold his home and his boat before the other sailors found out what he'd done. Both had been burned anyway. The inn was as sacred as hard ground could be to the hardy sailors of Mesto. It was taller than most buildings on the island, and its gabled roof stuck out like a mole on the handsome face of the harbour. Its second story spread out wider than the foundational taproom, and was buttressed in place by seasoned oak that would have otherwise been used to rib ships. Those beams were painted black with tar and stood boldly out against the whitewashed outer walls. It was grand, built with the care foreigners give to their temples. Most of the upper rooms could be rented and had windows made from small kites of glass. Those portals distorted the twinkle of the bay and pulled the shapes of people walking the dockside below into unreal shapes. Roberto spent the sober hours of each morning at his window, trying to hear the quiet noises of the fishermen going out, over the seals barking their bloodlust. He always sat resolutely, with his back to that window, as though he guarded the rising sun. The bands of sky fire behind him bled into the sea where the horizon curved, and filled his rented room with light the colour of splashed blood. The trunks, chests, and bundles, which represented his former life, occupied most of the floor around the bed. They were a burden, anchoring him to a place and time he could not return to nor escape from. Not until the war was done. Gradually, as the light whitened, his calm face became a mask of gritted teeth and frown lines, until he could take no more and would stalk downstairs to work on draining another barrel. Verdant Mesto sprang up from the sea like an emerald set in cliffs of white gold, and the nations to the west and the east coveted it. Such a place, they reasoned, represented a foothold from which to strike at one another in their perpetual conflict. Despite their war engines and triple-decked ships, neither had yet been able to claim Mesto, as the reef made any serious staging impractical until now. Roberto bought his ale and safety with coins from selling the secrets to both sides, and the waters around the harbour raged with the naval engagements his sail had precipitated between those nations. In the evenings, he often wondered whether his coin would run out before one group of foreigners emerged victorious. What would happen to him then? He could not think of an answer that felt true. He would certainly have to leave Mesto, aboard a ship heading west or east, depending on which side won. The lies he told himself usually continued that once there he would build a new life. Roberto, even when so drunk he could not walk without wobbling, was polite to the inn's staff. In return, they did not shun him and even seemed to care for him at the expense of their own reputations. They enabled his routine, which had become so predictable that he often would only have to look askance at the barrel woman or the serving lad to be given what he required. The island was holy, claimed the West, a place where their prophet had been born, only to then be executed by the East. The East feared the emboldened heresy if they were to allow the West to control Mesto. It would be simple to say they fought over a religious book, but after half a day of drinking, Roberto suspected the nations fought because that is what nations do. Like the seals, they compete for any resources it is possible to compete for, only to grow larger with the ultimate goal of being able to compete more successfully. It was only a matter of time before Mesto fell. Roberto had simply been the one to profit from foresight. Through bleary eyes, he knew it was time to switch to stronger liquor, when the serving lad used the taper to light the candle sconces around the tap room. Belly stuffed unpleasantly full with large meals, Roberto let the rum change his mind about the world. It became a darker place, where men were meaningless shadows wandering towards a bleak and bruised sunset. A rough cheer from all in the inn broke his reverie. "Peace! And quiet again!" one man shouted, his face still raw from the sea winds. "Those bastards fought themselves to a standstill!" In response, the others in his group beat dents into the bar with their tankards until the barrel woman filled them with celebratory ale. A gulp-laden calm spread out from the brash men who had brought the news in. Roberto peered at them, but could not make his eyes focus for much longer than a moment. What did their shadowy faces mean to him anyway? Or peace upon the sea, for that matter? Fuck it all. He lurched to his feet and stumbled towards the stairs without a shit given for those that watched him leave. The news had soured his rum. His overripe belly roiled as he bounced off the stairwell walls. He haphazardly shut the door to his room behind him and then completed his paranoid nightly ritual by dragging a heavy trunk in front of it, before emptying from both ends into the stained lavatory. He did not remember collapsing in bed, but huge, thudding blows of boots on wood woke him before the drink had a chance to wear more than partially off. The noise was confusing and coming from nearby. Roberto rolled over and watched the door to his room bounce in its frame, keeping time with the thudding sounds. The door burst, and the first two men fell over his trunk. Others helped them up and clambered in after them. They smelt of salt, fish guts, and tar. Roberto smiled at the scent, and didn't fight as they roughly tied his hands behind his back and dragged him from the room. They tossed him down the stairs, and the world tumbled past him until he slammed to a stop on its trussed arms. He felt his shoulders dislocate from the landing and mewled until one of his attackers kicked him savagely to quieten him. The barrel woman, wearing a nightdress and holding a lamp with a tulip-shaped glass cover, impassively watched him be taken. "You're wanted by your new friends," snarled the brash young man who had given the cheer. "Turns out they don't like to be crossed." They bundled him outside. Cold sea air filled him as panic made his breathing ragged and fast. Roberto realized it was the first time he had been outside in 3 weeks. The docks were sleepy, and all was stowed away in the neat fashion of men who make their living doing dangerous jobs. They dragged him along a pier and tossed him into the bow of a shallow boat. He wriggled painfully until he was sat upright and could watch Mesto grow smaller as each stroke of the oars made it shrink. The truth which had eluded him finally became clear. "I don't want to leave." The men with their backs to him chuckled. "Don't make me go," Roberto begged. "Shut it." The oars dipped, swung, and cut out of the bay as they passed into the reef. Huge, blubber-laden shadows bulged the sharp rocks around him. Roberto stood clumsily, rocking the boat as his damaged arms and bound hands made the task difficult. "Down!" one of the men hissed. A nearby shadow barked in response. Other hungry shapes snorted and lumbered to investigate the noise. Roberto tipped himself sideways and went over the gunwale, much to the delight of the barking seals.
I've not heard someone use cute little seals as a horror tool before, but I really fucking liked it.
Those seals were badass. That ossuary image.
Yeah. I find seals to be quite terrible. They're massive, like a proper like a bull seal. Terrifying.
The what is elephant seals? The really huge ones.
Yeah, I think those are the ones that I was sort of having in mind with these
Yeah.
particular ones. Yeah.
And leopard seals in the Antarctic are terrifying.
Nah, it's just a cute little puppy, isn't it?
I thought that was a really strong opening. I love the imagery. I love the idea of the the sort of harbinger of doom seals, and I love that we returned to them at the end. I thought that was great.
Yes.
There's a line I have to draw attention to. It's when you evoked that kind of old-fashioned pub beautifully. You still get them sometimes. In towns that are particularly maintaining their Tudor visage away. Those whitewashed, hard beamed pubs. And when you said it was built with the care foreigners give to their temples, it told us so much about that community. And in fact, a lot of communities of sort of those times where that was the most important building to people. It was just something you could drink safely, somewhere you could get a bed if you needed one. You evoked it so well. That was one of my favorite bits of description you've done.
Thank you.
Really
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. With the pub scene, you said that we can do feedback as well as there was one thing I thought that you could actually do a little more with the pub scene, which is that, like in the first third, you tell us that he is alienated from the people around them, or at least, tolerated, but is not very communicative. I find that the best way to show somebody's relationship with people around them, including if they don't really have one, is to show little interactions. And I think if we just saw him brush up against people, even if it's just like an exchange of glances rather than dialogue, or if it's a short verbal exchange, I think it would do two things for you. One, it would give you more of a sense of the place, which would back up the sense at the end that he doesn't want to leave. And it would give more of a sense of action in the earlier half of it, while drawing out nice and clearly what his taciturn relationship with other people is. So I think that's the only tweak I would suggest.
Yeah, I think it's a good tweak. I can definitely see what you're saying. There's obviously the bit where I sort of, as you say, tell that that he just has to look up and he gets what he wants. But that's obviously being told in this sort of general sense. It's not something that he's doing in the scene at that moment. It's something that he can do. So I definitely get what you're saying there, and I think you're right. I think that could certainly go in. Yeah, overall, I think it was. We've had a bit of a break over the Christmas and New Year period and all the rest of it, and it was one of those stories that I sort of potentially let myself get too lost in the descriptions potentially. But I really enjoyed it, so I sort of don't care, unfortunately. So I hope people liked it.
Well, no, they were good. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can tell you myself, I often, when I'm drafting, I describe. So it's, I think often we sort of think things out in descriptions and then, come back a month later and think, okay, I can crunch that paragraph down into a sentence here and there. Or maybe that's just me. Maybe you're more succinct in first drafts than I am. I'm certainly prolix in my first drafts.
I think essentially one of the other things that's been happening is that I've been reading quite a lot of, and I always get the name wrong. Do you pronounce it Truman Capote, or is it Capote? I still don't know. I'm gonna have to look this up.
I think it might be Capote.
There we go. I'm still. I need to like find a recording of him saying it himself.
That's a mic.
But anyway, I've been reading. I over Christmas I read A Christmas Memory, which is a famous short story by him, and it was so good. The writing was so good. It actually moved me to tears. And so I then started reading a few more bits of his and stuff. And it's all description, but he describes a lot of stuff with almost like by saying what it's not, or negative space imagery and stuff like that. So that was really running a riot through my head whilst I was trying to remember what my style is. So that might have had a hand in it. Sorry, Nico, I cut across you. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say that I thought you did some really nice stuff with building the culture of the island. The fact that they keep track of how many people have been eaten by the seals, but then that it was a record, the 7. So it's, they're almost part of the community. They were looking after the seals like you would your local team. So I think little touches like that, as much
Especially
as
because
that.
they form a kind of. Oh, sorry, I talked over you there.
No, please.
Just especially because the seals, in a sense, they're like the rampart around the community to the sea. So in a sense, they are sort of the not quite human, but not quite not human guards of the liminal space. That sounds dreadfully pretentious now I hear myself say it aloud, but you know what I mean? Like, seal voices are almost human, and in fact, seals can amazingly well imitate human voices. There's YouTube videos of somebody, a tame seal that imitated his trainer's Midwestern accent very accurately.
Oh, wild.
Oh, I hate
Yeah, so seals occupying that kind of halfway point. So they are almost part of the community.
I know that they think that they're responsible for where the myth of Selkies come from as well, right? That's supposed to be like a seal thing, I think. He's kind of.
I didn't know that one. I did know that apparently people say that the mermaid were manatee, and that how long you got to be at sea before you're like,
I'm gonna fuck that manatee.
that thing got tits.
Well, you know, my second book, In Great Waters, is about, I call them deepsmen rather than mermaids, after I figured out why I couldn't call them seamen as opposed to landsmen. But
Yep.
one of the characters is a hybrid of like half human, half landsman, half deepsman. And he only ever knew his mother, who shoved him up onto the shore for being too slow when he was young. And when he reflects on who his father must have been, he figures it must have been a sailor. But he thinks all I really need to know about the guy is that after a year at sea, probably some men will fuck anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I need to know about my father.
It's one of the
Like
great
that a lot.
struggles of armies throughout not so much ancient history as then no one cared. But you get to like World War One, they were putting bromine in everyone's rations so that no one would become aroused because they were so
Just calm it down.
that men would sleep with each other. Can you imagine such a horrifying thing?
It would have been quite good for morale. It sounds like if they'd just not done that, everybody could have just been boning.
They'd be too happy to fight. They should have put antidepressants in, because those do actually knock off the sex drive, and they might make people less depressed. I mean, not that I'm strictly advocating non-consensually doping your troops. So.
I don't know. We've got to try something new, haven't we?
Oh dear. Right. Anyway, I think we've plumbed the depths on that one. Thank you for listening, and thanks for your feedback. I appreciate both of you there. But Kit, do you fancy giving us a story?
Yes, there was talk of Selkies. Strap in, boys. Also, fair warning, this is a horror story. My novels are not sort of like dark folk fantasy rather than full horror, but when I go short, I tend to go more horrific.
Got you.
So, this is Harbour. Mr. Morris shows me at night. That is when the other fishermen come. That is what they are, what my mother and my aunties warned me of. Men who cast prisons into home and drag you gasping out. Mr. Morris is a fisherman. They call themselves something else. Magus is a word they say sometimes, but most often they call themselves students. They have eyes upon eyes. Some of them wear droplets upon their faces, which Mr. Morris calls glasses and spectacles. And sometimes they step close to the tank and hold up droplets that Mr. Morris says are to magnify. All the world is smaller here in the thin air, and Mr. Morris says they would look on me. If I do not stay close to the tank glass when they wish to look on me, he says he will drain the water and leave me beached tonight. I am, says Mr. Morris, the pride of his collection. This place is what they call a coastal aquarium, and that is why there are the tanks. For the students, he says it is a perfect environment to hide in plain sight, a true marvel. To the tourists who come to stare, the words he says are sustainable and educational and ecologically neutral. This means that he dips his pots in the harbour and pulls out whatever little creatures swim into them, and for a few weeks holds them prisoner. No, that is not what he says. He says, we keep them as our guests for a few weeks. Those are the ones he shows in the day. Mostly they don't plead to go home. The tanks are evening blue, and the top-knot fish in them are ripples of shade. the soft tan of whispering sand and the rich brown of wavering kelp, wry-necked and crook-mouthed and beautiful. I could hold one in my arms and whisper to it. I could eat one alive, dig in my teeth and tear the wincing flesh from its fine, pearly bones. No, I may not do that. Give me back my seal skin, I wish every moment. Give it me back. Let me slip away home. Mr. Morris says, behave yourself. There is a tank of tame mullet the tourists feed. They can dangle their hands in the motor-driven water, and the mullets swim up to nibble the flakes they drop. They laugh and squeal, the tourists. They shriek. I tried to shriek to them, but he came and banged the glass so the world flinched around me and my bones were storm-shuddered. You want your supper? Mr. Morris says. You want to stay in the water? I nod. I want these things. I want them with every grain of my flesh. You let us study, he says. I haven't destroyed your skin yet, but don't think I won't. I say, I'll serve if you give it back. He has taught me to talk to him. The students hark to my voice. Marvellous, they say. An extraordinary mimic. They say, echo, and they call me a sea nymph. So I say, I beg, please just to tell me when you'll give it back. Mr. Morris says, everything in its own time. There is much to learn of you. They swim to the children's hands, the mullets. Mr. Morris says to the children, our mullets are the only things captive bred here. In the wild they're very skittish, but because these ones have hatched here, they trust humans. Skittish is what you are when you have legs. You skitter, you skip, you stick your feet against the soil. Or he calls them flighty, which is what you are when you have wings. This is not how we call in the language of the deeps, but he does not know of it. I speak only the words he teaches me. The mullets do not know any language. They swim to the hands of children, and they do not dream of the fathoms. I am a wonder, says Mr. Morris. In the days of old, an untaught man would have catched me as a wife and make me cook and birth for him. But he says, those were times that lacked scholarly rigour. He says, my hair is black as night, and good for binding knots in a spell, and if I shriek when he pulls it out, he does not give me my supper. But, he says, it is only black hair with no properties beyond the fact that its colour makes it easy to see when working against a template. It is disappointing. The students say they had hopes of my blood, and he took it for them in a sucking spine he called a syringe and told me he'd burn my skin if I fought. But they say they found it less potent in spells than common human, never mind innocent blood, and this, perhaps, is a proof I have no soul. Mr. Morris says, if I have no soul, I might perhaps be made useful in rituals, for what I do not have cannot be imperilled. Give me back my seal skin, I wish every moment. Give me my skin. Then one day I wish it too much where he can hear me, and he drains the tank for the night. I lie weighted under my own bones, and the air rubs coral harsh over me, and I cannot breathe. I must breathe. I cannot breathe. He comes back next morning and finds me dying of body grief, and he says, do not ask again. Do not waste your time or mine. I do not ask after that. I think of mullet. I think how they swim tame to the hands of squeaking children. I think of how tourists feed the tame. I am the pride of their collection, but I am a poor servant. I cannot foretell, and I will not sing home songs, for if they know there is a language of the deeps, then Mr. Morris will hurt me until I teach it him. I hear what Mr. Morris cannot, because I was born to hear songs from far away. I hear the chants the tourist people tell their children, and the whispers that come through the nets they wear in their ears. In the day, there are children. They are mullet, these children, captive bred. They swim up to his hand because nobody has taught them to keep away from him. So, they do not know to keep away from me. One more time I ask Mr. Morris, will ever I have back my skin? He pulls from my scalp hair he cannot use and says, Echo, enough. Ask once more and I'll drain the tank again. I say, my skin is gone. I do not ask. Mr. Morris looks at me with his bleach-rimmed eyes. He says, experimentation is important. It is for the betterment of mankind. I will not hear a word more. I did not feel my skin burn or slice or maul, for when he destroyed it, it was not on my back. I do not know what they did to it, but I know, and my bones howl. They howl hard enough to shudder a wail. My skin is gone. My skin is gone. I will never seal dive, for I am robbed. My skin is gone. But then Mr. Morris does not watch me in the day, and I have learned the songs that children follow. I am in my tank. The water is stale, and the air above is sorrowful as shore. I do not have the skin for it, but I can sing. The child is in my room, and her mother is in the other room with Mr. Morris and her other little fry. And when I sing, I echo. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. The child wonders what I am. The child walks to my tank on its skin-shod feet. After the slip of arm and the splash and the bite and the flaying pull, there is a gnarl of blood in the tank, but it is shuttered, and it will be tonight before Mr. Morris sees. Out of the tank in my new skin I climb. When I step to the ground and cover myself over with wet clothes, I stretch my fingers in their new covering. The air is soft, and it does not burn. A voice calls, Daisy! It is a mother voice, a summon voice, a high voice seeking to shoal. A voice that will feed this skin's mouth and teach it better English and not pull its hair. My new skin is tight, for the child was little. But little ones grow. One day a bigger me will come back and take his skin from him. I step to the ground and call, Coming, Mummy! My voice is an echo, and Mummy hears only the sound of her little one. I run to shoal with her as if I were tame, and she takes my soft new hand in hers.
Oh damn, that's really good. That's an absolutely top-notch story. Nice work.
Thank you.
Deeply creepy.
Yeah, deeply creepy, very, very unsettling. Just filled with lovely descriptions as well. I think obviously I was already enjoying it, but I think the first time that it really grabbed me in terms of the description was the sort of elongated discussion of the droplets on the face, and I think that worked really, really well to set up this alternate angle on the world of her perspective, and then it got faster and faster and faster, and it just flowed really nicely from that point. I really enjoyed that a lot. There's a lot that I liked about that, so thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think those alien worldviews can be very difficult to get right, and you did, like Ben says, starting off with talking about droplets for glass. But I wrote down it was very early, but men who cast prisons into home, and it was such a sentence whose structure couldn't really work in our perspective, and I was like, okay, I'm immediately it's so clearly through the eyes of someone who thinks and feels differently to us that it got me.
I do love
into
fooling
that.
around with that kind of thing.
Also, we often talk about the strange connections between stories. The fact that you both had seal as the animals chosen in your story is weird.
And that I then brought up Selkies as well. Absolutely wild. Yeah, the whole stealing the seal skin and then that sort of traps them in that form, the form of a woman. I really enjoyed it scratched a really interesting bit of my brain where you were talking about how in the old days they'd do that and then the man would just make them cook and birth.
Yeah.
But Mr. Morris has rigorous scientific method. It's like, that's worse. That's worse. They're both bad. That's worse.
Alchemical methods, at least. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's a very traditional story, and one of the things I really love to do is, especially because it gives me the opportunity to fool around with different perspectives and look at ways language can express that. What I really love to do is take old traditions and just spin them round like a top and think, what kind of tune can I get out of this if I make it spin? Like my most recent books, the Gyrford books, you mentioned that they're about fairy smiths, which is actually, it's a whole spin on the fact that there's a folk tradition that iron repels fairies and spirits. Terry Pratchett has some fun stuff with that in Lords and Ladies. So one day I just started thinking, you know what? If that was the case, you would have specialist iron workers, wouldn't you? And then I started thinking, well, can I tell this story? Or shall I save it for the next one? How fairies.
I see what you mean. Yeah, well, I mean, we'll be talking about it. I think if people are interested, then they can tune into the next episode, and you can give us a more detailed thing. But I think just in terms of your story, I think it's excellent proof that if people enjoyed that, it sounds like they're going to enjoy the book. So they should definitely check out. So I believe the first one is called In the Heart of Hidden Things. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, they're both, and the second is called All the Hollow of the Sky. They're both quotes from poems. The first is by Charlotte Mew, the second is by William Wordsworth.
Ooh, Wordsworth. I grew up for a time in Cumbria, so Wordsworth was just absolutely everywhere. So that's nice. Yeah.
He's not a poet I especially like. I was looking for an appropriate poetic quote in a poem that alluded to cuckoos, because cuckoos and changelings are a big theme in the story. And when I came across this Wordsworth poem, I was just like, oh, it's got to be Wordsworth. Seriously, come on, Christina Rossetti, come on, Mary Elizabeth Browning. Nobody's got anything for me but Wordsworth. And it's like one of his really bad poems too, where he goes out with a clipboard and counts shit. Like the stars are out by 2 trees, and there's one or two thrushes and a far off river that rushes and a river that rushes and something that gushes, and just before you get to the public convenience that flushes and you're wondering why he was ever allowed to write poems, he turns around and says, and the cuckoo's sovereign cry fills all the hollow of the sky.
Yeah, that's
and then the fact of writing bobbins, but there's just a beautiful in the middle of it. Beautiful at times, so needed an editor.
Just on language, I really enjoyed the little bit towards the end where the Selkie discusses how they've deliberately hidden their language, because if they knew that there was a language, they would torture it out of her.
You can't trust people.
Say again, sorry?
You can't trust humans.
You can't trust it. No, of course, no. But there was just something about that, like that this idea of first contact, because it's sort of a first contact story, at least for her, isn't it? And we were talking about alien perspectives earlier when you were talking, Nico. And it is interesting, isn't it, to hold your language back, to be taught somebody else's language, feign inability to speak, and it's so important that you'll let it complicate your captivity.
I think it's actually deployed really nicely in the story, where even we, the reader, are not fully trusted. We're told you skitter with feet and you fly with wings, but there we have a word for what you do underwater, and then we don't get the word. We're not trusted with it. I thought that's a really nice touch.
Yeah.
And so much of language is at least a little figurative. So if you think about what senses are appealed to when we use figurative language, I think it can give you a really strong feeling of the sensory experience of being a certain kind of person.
So I'm going to have to talk about the how the child's skin is so tight on them because it's a small child that they've killed and skinned, and then they've worn the skin to get out of their captivity. That was an absolutely horrendous image, and I really liked it. I thought that was excellent. I could see the kind of like the almost like fit to bursting child skin pulled over this larger form,
Try
and
not to think about Men in Black.
well, yeah, no, I did. To be honest, that hadn't even occurred to me because it was so. I was so inside the world that you created that it just it held my attention completely. But I did have this idea of like what the face would look like, especially
Mm.
when you did the very creepy child voice. So I think that was for me. That was just start to finish very very strong, and I really enjoyed the way that you shifted gears throughout it. Um, and yeah, deeply creepy. And I can see why you prefaced it by saying that it was definitely a horror story. So
Well, thank you
very
very
good,
much.
very good. Shall we move on to the third and final story, Nico? Are you ready?
Oh, apparently.
Let's go.
Harbour. I had a feeling the date was slipping between my fingers. We were 2 courses in. I hadn't dared touch the wine, though on reflection, maybe that half of my personality would have been rendered somehow more enchanting by it. I was manually steering myself away from being a so-called creep. It's a concept I struggled with a bit, but my research into femme-centric memes had taught me a lot. I'd ruined my algorithm by loudly talking about Dyson hair products and Googling fairy-based sex literature. But it had started delivering me content I couldn't have imagined on my own. I couldn't refer to her as a female, I know that now. Then there was fighting my own inner monologue. Don't say things like ample bosoms, even on the inside. And definitely don't call her a waifu. Mummy milkers, as phrases went, was definitely off the table. So much thought, in fact, was being expended on my efforts to appear what society laughably calls normal, that I was having to let my mouth, and whatever piece of mind meat was attached to it, run on autopilot. I didn't know what I was talking about. I wasn't listening to myself anymore. I was too busy trying to hold myself in the right contorted position for maximum sexual appeal. You know, shoulders wide, jaw strong, which is very hard while talking away like I was. I'd hoped that I was leaving ample gaps for her to put her retorts into. I'm sure I was. But women like men who talk and listen and communicate and whatever else they called it. So I was talking. There was an abrupt bump in the mental road as my recall plunged a hand into the depths of my mind looking for a word. I felt it clutch around, desperately looking for something that my flow state had deemed important. It was grasping for harbour. The shakeabout in my mentality meant that suddenly I was being drafted into full awareness of my conversational assault. Why was I talking about harbours? Had she revealed some fascination with shipwrights? Were we planning our honeymoon around the great ports of the world? Unlikely. Harbour. Bloody David Harbour. That's his name. So anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, so his movie shares some similarities with the Ron Perlman ones, or Del Toro ones, to be more accurate, but why? Why was I explaining the actors who had played Hellboy? That seemed odd. Well, no, actually it did make some sense. I looked without looking at the scattering of scorch marks where her elbows had, at various points, been placed on the table. I allowed myself to smell the stink of her wine boiling in her hand as she delicately grasped her glass. That was what had sparked it. Was it racist then? Shit, that was something women were definitely not very keen on according to the internet. They tended to be left-leaning. Young women did, according to the internet. Of course, she only looked young by human standards. What with the pertness of her... No, I've been over this. So she could be old, ageless, but you don't ask a lady's age, only consent, apparently. So was it racist to talk to a succubus about Hellboy? Was that like talking to someone at the Royal British Legion about Churchill, sort of aspirational and charging, or more like talking to a priest about Jesus? Well, you think very well he isn't real, but they definitely do think he is real, or at least you'd hope so. Maybe he was real. That'd be a turn up, wouldn't it? Sort of like Hell's Santa, except real. What was my mouth saying? So, Louise, who is another BPRD agent, should I explain them again? No, you got it, didn't you? Well, he has been turned into a vampire in Mexico, and fuck, I was giving a full plot breakdown. I'd presumably already done both Del Toro Hellboys, and I'd made my way into the David Harbour one. I'd find a way to pump the brakes before I got to Crooked Man. It was good, and the plot deserved a recount, but her inscrutable features seemed irritating. Or maybe they didn't? Stupid inscrutability. I had to formulate a plan, and I had roughly 2 acts of the story to get through in which to do it. I'd expended an enormous amount of energy and resources summoning the succubus, Amanthea the Insatiable. Well, the name had sounded spot on in account of my wanting to be satiated myself. Some people online had reckoned that insatiability was a double-edged sword. Yeah, of course you get your dinkle wrinkled, but how insatiable really was insatiable? It's a tricky metric, especially when one end of the scale could potentially have you ejaculating your own skeleton in a sort of blood geese demon fuck frenzy. I didn't want to jizz up my bones. Not yet, anyway. I'd burned a really old frontier Bible I stole from a museum when I visited America and spent hours drawing runes, and so far was only managing dinner conversation. Strike that. Monologuing. Conversation goes both ways. I had to work out what the right step was to actually get the satiation situation engaged. I'd never actually asked a female to engage in any sort of coital activity outside of Second Life before, so wasn't 100% sure of the go-to phrases and demonstrations. I had assumed she would pop out of her hell portal and grab me by the bits and we'd just do the business. But apparently dinner first was a big part of it. Dinner was happening. She'd set the tablecloth alight with every touch, and they'd had to get a metal chair out of the summer storage as the wooden ones kept disintegrating. But dinner was happening. Stage 1, complete, and I could move this on. I own a lot of IKEA furniture, and was acutely aware that back to my place would be a disaster, of the inexpensive and wildly flammable variety. I had to interrupt myself, I reckoned, because I was stuck in a loop, and I was going to blow this whole thing if I didn't, much like I had every time before. Sealed the deal. So that's sort of how it ends, really. They set up for a sequel, but that didn't come as it had a poor critical and audience reception, which is fair enough, really. What are you doing after this, then? Her eyes widened as I actually engaged her instead of spewing Hellboy cinematic universe trivia. There was something akin to a smile on her strange, alien face. Well, no one else has summoned me tonight, so what would you like to do? I swallowed hard. I felt sweat developing in rivulets in every place that might come into contact with a sexual partner. I began to smell faintly of cheap Cornish pasties. The funk of my Lynx deodorant was not up to the task. We could go to yours, maybe see what happens. I couldn't believe it. I'd said it, hadn't I? Like an absolute legend. Oh, of course. We were always going to mine. You don't get to just summon a demon and walk away unscathed. A relief, really. I thought you were going to ask me to shag you. I'm so tired of it. You are? Well, yes, I am. I might be insatiable, but not for sex. What a boring thing to think. I was bewildered for a moment. Then what? I asked, my voice a quiver. Mortal Planes movie trivia. You know, for a minute there, you were onto a good one. If you'd got to Crooked Man, I might even have let you live. With a snap of her fingers, a ring of flame appeared around us. The restaurant vanished and was replaced with every super cool metal album cover you can possibly imagine, except I wasn't on a motorbike and I'd already started to catch fire. She screamed a banshee's wail into what I could only assume was eternal night, and I felt safe in the fact I'd been right about women all along. They just want to drag you down.
Well, I laughed throughout. It's quite good that I was muted, I think. That was bloody hilarious.
The alternate
I've had
title
my hands over my mouth trying to laugh silently.
The alternate title for that one is Incel in Hell. You can
Incel in Hell. I will accept Incel in Hell. Within moments of you starting to talk, I wrote down Incel alert in all capital letters in my notes.
Oh, they are delightful to write.
Woo!
It's like turning yourself just as dumb as you possibly can for whatever time it takes you to write that character. It's so refreshing when your brain turns back on afterwards.
It was a strength of the story that there was a very strong narrator personality.
Did you get a little bit worried about him at any point during that story? I know I did. Bloody
You didn't
hell.
think about this at FantasyCon.
Well,
Oh, dear.
I did wonder, like, is she insatiable for whatever you start the topic with? So, like, if you'd started with sex, she might have gone, let's have sex until you die, but instead, started with movie chat, so...
Yep. I liked that turn. I thought that was a very good turn, because...
But no, I wasn't worried for him. It was too comedic to be worried.
Oh, good.
Yeah. But obviously the conceit of the story is that it's a problem that he's speaking like this because he's on a date, and then you sort of gradually realise that he's not really on a date. He's on a date with a like a succubi or something, a demon.
I like when that was in.
Yes, it was nice with the wine boiling and the singeing of the tablecloth. I enjoyed the fact that they had to go and get a metal chair out of summer storage. That felt very well observed, despite the fact that this has never happened anywhere.
We've all been there. Why do they call it a hot date?
Hot date, yeah.
I'll show myself up.
It was it was almost the non-gags that were getting me. It was the one at the end, for what I could only assume was Eternal Night. It was just it had like it was very Pratchett. I think it was very wry humor.
I liked it, except that I wasn't on a motorbike.
Yeah.
There's just so much in that.
Can you Nico? Can you never say "mommy milkers" to me ever again? Is that okay?
Or maybe anyone.
Or anyone, or indeed anyone.
Oh, yeah. It's a phrase I've seen knocking about, in memes and things. And as I wrote it down, I thought that really is a deeply uncomfortable pair of words, isn't it?
It actually perfectly ties in that kind of horrendous low male mentality into Kit's story of how in the old days they would make people cook and birth for them. Make these selkies cook and birth them. It's that's the level of horror that is inside the phrase "mommy milkers." Contorted position for maximum sexual appeal.
Sorry, you see. Sorry, go on, Kit.
Oh, no. I was just going to say, I like that there was something kind of sweet and naive about him as well.
Yeah.
I think if he had just been a loathsome creep, it would have been a less kind story, but also less engaging. That, like, you sort of feel like, maybe if somebody had got to him and had a word with him sooner, he wouldn't be in this mess.
Yeah, I get that. I think there is a bit of pathos to him, isn't there? I think and he is trying, bless him, manually steering himself away from being a creep. It's just unfortunate that's his default, isn't it? That he's been sort of corrupted at a core internal monologue level by incel culture.
It's happening a lot online, isn't it? But like that, contorting yourself into the perfect position. There's people who look at photos and they say, "Look, he's leaning at 45 degrees. He's emasculated himself. Burn him on a pyre." Just
Oh, really?
wild to me. Oh yeah.
I was sort of imagining it as like he was just like holding himself in the position and almost like vibrating from how like problematic it was to do that. And it was just every time I thought of that, it added to whatever gag line that you'd put in because I just imagined him being in that pose. That was really,
My
really
brain went
funny.
to,
Really funny.
are there male cheesecake poses? Like, has he
What's a
got his arm
cheesecake
behind
pose?
his head? Oh, well, like cheesecake shots of, bikini girls sprawled in like very soft titillation cheesecake.
Oh, I don't think I've encountered this phrase, cheesecake poses. I like it though.
I'm maybe showing my age. It's a quite old-fashioned phrase for like very soft porn cheesecake.
Cheesecake.
Yeah,
That's a decent euphemism. I like cheesecake.
She's simply clad, but you get a good look at her titties.
Solid.
Oh, beautiful.
Solid. What were you saying? Go on,
it's
sorry.
not often I write a joke myself that then catches me up later. And I nearly fell over saying the line, I don't want to jizz out all my bones.
Yeah, I wrote that one down.
I don't know why that's so funny to me.
It was the way that you said it as well. I didn't want to jizz up my bones.
It's almost plaintive.
Yeah.
What that?
Oh, pop out of her hell portal and grab me by the bits also got me.
Wrinkle my dinkle. I also quite like that one.
I did write down wrinkle my dinkle. Yes, that was
I'm not
solid.
quite sure I understand the anatomy of that, but I'm also not quite sure I want to know.
I'm not sure that character understands the anatomy of that, actually. I think that's okay.
I wrote it and I don't know what it means, so...
You would have thought that was something... To me, this sounds like a reaction you'd have to a woman that really puts you off, if I can put it delicately. It's like, oh no, she totally wrinkles my dinkle. Ugh.
Yes, it's almost you would potentially call it a direction or something. It sounds like it's the wrong way, doesn't it? You don't want shrinkage happening in that situation.
You don't want a wrinkled dinkle.
You don't want a wrinkled dinkle, no. You want it taut and
she makes your wretch stretch.
Oh. No, I don't like that.
Sorry, you started it.
So you make my winkle sprinkle, that'll do, won't it? I don't know.
Turns you into a tumescent peasant? No? Okay.
That's telling us a lot about you.
Yeah. What, are you getting hard?
Casual.
Oh, really good. I really enjoyed that.
I take this moment to let the audience know there was a point just before we started recording, interrupted on the computer by a call from my mum. So
yeah.
I don't think I'll be encouraging her to listen to this.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we've had 3 very different stories there. I really enjoyed both of your stories, so thank you very much for very, very different reasons. I feel like I've run the full gamut today with the...
I also want to say respect Nico for so boldly taking an interpretation of the word harbour.
What's his name, isn't it? David Harbour.
that actually hadn't even occurred to me to comment on that because Nico is the master at doing that. It's just you get to the end and you're like, that was fantastic. What the fuck did that have to do with the prompts? I think I've potentially done it about twice as well as you do it. But it's fucking wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. As I know that you are a Hellboy guy as well, so that must have come from a deep place, that one.
So we've had these conversations before when occasionally I'll be in the shower and I'll be sort of talking
not with
to
me,
myself,
to be clear.
Not, yeah. Ben gets out and then I start thinking about
yeah, there is.
And I was thinking, harbour, what can I do for a harbour? And the only 2 things my brain would give me were elves going on boats somewhere and David Harbour. And I don't want to write a story about fucking David Harbour. So anyway, I wrote a story about David Harbour.
There's something about being perverse, isn't there? I think most of the good stuff I've written has happened because at some point I got fed up with trying to be sensible and gone, fuck it, I'm doing something silly.
Mm.
If I ever decide to try sensible, I'll let you know and we can meet in the middle somewhere.
Very strong, right. Very strong. So yeah, before we depart this episode, Kit, would you just be up for telling people where they can follow you online, hear about your news, buy your books, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. So the best place to find me online is on Blue Sky. I am at Kit Whitfield. I will skeet about books. Mostly I just skeet cool pictures with attempts at interesting alt text descriptions, and I don't do politics or upsetting stuff. And if you want my books, order them from your local bookstore if you can. If you want to support local bookshops online, uk.bookshop.org is the place. Or if, like me, your Kindle scum, they are on Amazon.
Excellent. And are we pointing people towards the Gyrford?
Those are the ones whose sales would help me most because they're the most recent. But they're also my favourites.
Wonderful.
They are a 2-part series, but you can read each of them independently. They take place with the same characters. They contain dark humour, lush landscapes, a pig that thinks it's the Gawain poet, bleak references to disability rights, and a fiery black dog that eats landlords.
Ooh, my favourite.
Right, gang. You heard the lady. You've got 1 week. Get reading, and we'll see you in a week's time for an interview. And you better know everything about those books because there's going to be a quiz at the end.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Tiny Bookcase.
Remember to subscribe, otherwise you're going to miss out on the future fun.
Also, tell a friend. If you like this episode, link them to it.
We'd be tremendously grateful. You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, Facebook at The Tiny Bookcase, and Instagram at BookcaseTiny for updates. Speaking of supporting the podcast, well, magic can only take one so far. The Tiny Bookcase is supported by the generosity of its patrons. Those kind souls have really kept my belly full the last year. Let's cast a spell for them, shall we? For rich ginger tones on their scalp, let us cast the Orangi Hedondo spell for Scott Byrne. And for general fabulousness, why not the Ooh La La, How's Your Mother spell on Matthew McLaren?
How do you come up with that shit, man?